"You do not belong in this conversation." Those were the exact words the HOA President used while standing in front of the entire neighborhood meeting. Everyone looked at me as if I was just another homeowner who would stay quiet and accept whatever decision had already been made. What they did not know was that I had learned a long time ago that the loudest person in the room is not always the one with the strongest position. My name is Daniel Carter, and for most of my life, I have kept things simple. I maintain my property, respect my neighbors, and avoid unnecessary conflicts. I never cared about titles, appearances, or trying to impress anyone. That was probably why Victoria Reynolds, the HOA President, underestimated me from the beginning. I lived in a modest home compared to some of the larger properties in the community. I drove an older truck. I rarely attended social events. To Victoria, those things meant I had no influence, and no ability to challenge her decisions. The problem started when the HOA announced a major community project that affected several properties, including mine. During the meeting, I asked a simple question about the documentation behind the decision. I wanted to know where the authority came from and whether every homeowner had been properly informed. Instead of answering directly, Victoria smiled and told the room that some people simply did not understand how communities were managed. Then she looked directly at me and suggested that my concerns came from not understanding my place. I could feel the room becoming uncomfortable, but I did not respond emotionally. I simply wrote down every statement and every detail. After the meeting, I returned home and reviewed the documents I already had. Something about the situation did not make sense. The HOA was acting with complete confidence, but confidence does not replace proof. Over the next few days, I began collecting every notice, email, and community document connected to the decision. I was not trying to start a fight. I was trying to understand why the rules seemed to apply differently depending on who was involved. Then, one morning, I received a phone call from my bank. The representative told me there was an issue involving a property record connected to my account. At first, I assumed it was a routine question. Then she said something that immediately changed my understanding of what was happening. She told me the bank had discovered a document that appeared to conflict with information being used by the HOA. I asked what kind of document it was. She said it involved ownership records and a financial agreement that had never been reviewed by the community association. That was the moment I realized this was not just about an argument at an HOA meeting. Someone had built an entire decision on information that might not have been accurate. Victoria thought she knew exactly who I was. She thought I was someone without influence, without resources, and without a way to challenge her. What she did not know was that the bank had just uncovered the first piece of evidence that could reveal the biggest mistake she had ever made. The bank representative did not call me because of a problem with my account. She called because someone else had been using information connected to my property without understanding the full history behind it. After our conversation ended, I immediately contacted the branch manager and requested a formal review of the documents they had discovered. I did not want assumptions. I wanted copies, dates, signatures, and records. That was the same approach I had taken with the HOA from the beginning. The next morning, I met with the bank representative at their office. She placed a small folder on the table and explained that during a routine review of property-related records, their team noticed something unusual. A financial document connected to my property referenced a long-standing ownership agreement that did not match the information being used by the HOA. The difference seemed minor at first, but it changed the entire situation. According to the bank records, a portion of the property connected to the community project had never been transferred, sold, or assigned to the HOA. It remained under my ownership. I asked the representative why this mattered. She explained that organizations often rely on property information when making decisions, but those decisions are only as accurate as the records behind them. If the underlying information is wrong, every action based on it can create problems. I left the bank with certified copies of the documents, and immediately contacted my attorney, Michael Brooks. Michael had helped me review property agreements in the past, and he understood why this discovery was important. He carefully examined the paperwork and compared it with the documents provided by the HOA. After several hours, he found something that surprised even him. The HOA had been using a community map that showed the area differently from the official ownership records held by the bank and county. It was not just a disagreement about interpretation. The documents came from different sources, and only one matched the legal ownership history. Meanwhile, Victoria Reynolds continued moving forward as if nothing had changed. She announced that the HOA board would hold a special community meeting in 10 days to finalize the new policy that started this entire dispute. She still believed the majority of residents supported her position. She still believed I was someone who could be ignored. I decided not to reveal everything immediately. Instead, I continued gathering information. I requested older county records, reviewed previous property transfers, and organized every document in chronological order. The more I looked, the clearer the pattern became. The HOA had not simply misunderstood one document. They had built their decision on information that had never been fully verified. 2 days later, Michael called me with another discovery. He had located a property agreement from years earlier that had never appeared in any HOA records. The agreement involved a section of land that the HOA believed it controlled. According to the document, that assumption might have been wrong from the very beginning. The special HOA meeting was now only 8 days away, and Victoria was preparing to present her version of the story to the entire community. She did not know that the bank documents had opened the door to a much bigger question. If the HOA did not actually control the property, it was making decisions about what else had been built on a mistake. The closer I looked at the documents, the more I realized this was not just a disagreement between a homeowner and an HOA. It was a problem that had been developing quietly for years. The special HOA meeting was now only 8 days away, and Victoria Reynolds was preparing to present her decision to the entire community. She believed the issue was simple. She believed the rules were on her side. But the records I had collected told a completely different story. The morning after Michael Brooks found the old property agreement, we met at the county records office to verify every detail. I wanted to make sure we were not missing anything. A single mistake could change the entire outcome, and I knew that facts mattered more than emotions. The county clerk helped us locate the original property transfers, development documents, and archived maps connected to the neighborhood. After comparing the records, Michael found something important. The HOA map used for community decisions was created years after the original property records. It was not an official ownership document. It was a planning reference that showed the neighborhood layout, but it did not prove legal control over every section of land. That difference had never been explained to the residents. The HOA had treated a community map as if it carried the same authority as a recorded property document. It did not. The discovery changed how we viewed Victoria's actions. She may have believed she was protecting the community, but she had been making decisions based on information that was incomplete. I continued reviewing the documents and found another detail that made the situation even more complicated. Several years earlier, the developer had included a note about verifying certain property boundaries before future community changes. That note had been attached to a file that the HOA board never appeared to review. The warning had existed, but nobody had followed up. Meanwhile, Victoria announced the upcoming meeting with confidence. She sent a message to residents explaining that the HOA needed support to continue the planned changes. She described the disagreement as a misunderstanding caused by one homeowner refusing to cooperate. I read that message carefully and saved a copy. I knew the most important part of the story was not what she said about me. It was what the documents would reveal about the decision-making process. Michael suggested that we prepare a complete presentation for the meeting, including the bank records, county documents, and ownership history. I agreed, but I still wanted to find one more piece of information. We needed to know why the HOA had never discovered the ownership issue before. 2 days later, the bank contacted me again. This time, they had found an older financial record connected to the original property agreement. The representative explained that the document contained a reference to a previous review involving the same area of land. Someone had questioned the ownership details years earlier. The question had been answered, but the information never reached the HOA records. That meant the mistake was not new. It had been hidden in plain sight for years. The special meeting was getting closer, and Victoria was about to ask the entire neighborhood to support a decision built on incomplete information. But now I had a new question. If the records had existed all along, who decided they did not matter? The day before the HOA meeting, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by every document we had collected. The room was quiet, but my thoughts were moving quickly. For weeks, Victoria Reynolds had been telling residents that I was the problem. She wanted everyone to believe I was refusing to cooperate, but the record showed something very different. The question was no longer whether I had a disagreement with the HOA. The question was how many decisions had been made using incomplete information. Michael Brooks arrived that morning with another update. He had reviewed the additional bank records and found a connection that changed the timeline. The financial agreement from years earlier showed that the ownership details had been reviewed before the HOA was even created. Someone had already confirmed the property boundaries. The information was not missing. It had simply never been included in the HOA files. Michael explained that this was important because it showed the HOA had access to accurate information at some point. The problem was not a lack of available records. The problem was that the wrong records became the foundation for later decisions. I asked Michael if this meant Victoria had intentionally misled everyone. He shook his head and said we needed to be careful. The documents proved the HOA relied on incorrect information, but they did not prove what every individual knew or believed. That was why the meeting mattered. The facts needed to be presented clearly without exaggeration. Later that afternoon, I received another call from the bank. The representative explained that their review team had found a second document connected to the original agreement. It was a confirmation letter showing that the property information had been updated after a previous ownership review. The letter contained a reference number and a date that matched the county records. It was another piece of evidence showing that the official information had existed long before the HOA made its decisions. I organized the documents in order. First, the original property records. Second, the bank confirmations. Third, the county files. Fourth, the HOA documents that relied on the incorrect information. The timeline became impossible to ignore. The next morning, the HOA meeting began with a full room of residents. Victoria stood at the front and explained why she believed the board had acted correctly. She described the situation as a challenge from one homeowner against the community's decisions. Many residents listened quietly because they had only heard one side of the story. Then Victoria opened the floor for questions. Michael stood beside me, but I stepped forward myself. I did not want the conversation to be about conflict. I wanted it to be about records. I placed the documents on the table and explained that the issue was not about challenging the HOA's authority. It was about making decisions based on accurate information. As residents reviewed the first pages, the room became more focused. People started asking why the original ownership documents had never been discussed. Victoria tried to explain that the board had trusted previous information provided during development. Then Michael presented the bank record showing the ownership review had already happened years earlier. That was the moment the direction of the meeting changed. The residents were no longer asking why I refused to cooperate. They were asking why the HOA had never checked the information before acting. But just as the meeting reached its most important moment, one board member revealed something unexpected. The person who originally entered the incorrect property information into the HOA system was not who anyone expected. The room became silent after the board member revealed that the person who entered the incorrect property information into the HOA system was not Victoria Reynolds. For the first time during the entire meeting, the focus moved away from me and toward the process that created the misunderstanding. The board member explained that years earlier, a temporary administrator had transferred information from a development planning map into the HOA database. The mistake was not discovered because everyone assumed the information had already been verified. That single assumption affected every decision that followed. Victoria looked surprised, but she quickly explained that she had inherited the records and trusted the information already stored by the HOA. Michael Brooks did not argue with her. Instead, he asked a simple question. If the records were uncertain, why did the HOA move forward with decisions that affected property rights without confirming the official documents? Nobody answered immediately. The residents began reviewing the papers more carefully. They were seeing the timeline for the first time. The HOA had not created the original mistake, but the leadership had continued relying on it without performing a proper review. That difference mattered. The problem was no longer about one person being right or wrong. It was about accountability and responsibility. After the meeting ended, several residents approached me privately. Some admitted they had believed Victoria's version because they trusted the HOA leadership. Others said they never realized community decisions could be based on information that had not been fully checked. I told them the same thing I had believed from the beginning. Mistakes happen, but the solution is always to find the truth and correct the process. The next morning, Michael called me with another update. The bank had completed its internal review and found one more document connected to the property agreement. This document was different from the others because it showed communication between the original lender and the developer before the neighborhood was created. The record included a note explaining that ownership details needed to be preserved during future community planning. That note changed the situation again. It meant the developer had been aware that the property boundaries required special attention before the HOA ever existed. Michael explained that this did not mean the developer acted improperly, but it showed the importance of verifying information before creating new policies. Meanwhile, Victoria scheduled another HOA board meeting to discuss how the association would correct its records. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. Residents who once supported every HOA decision wanted transparency. They wanted to know how the system could be improved. I watched as the conversation shifted from defending a decision to fixing a problem. The person who had once been called a nobody was now the person everyone wanted answers from. But I knew the story was not finished yet. Michael discovered one final detail while reviewing the bank records. There was an old approval document connected to the original community formation that had a signature from someone with authority over the development. That signature could reveal whether the HOA ever had the right information when it made its first decisions. The final answer was still hidden in one last document. The final document Michael Brooks discovered was the one piece of information we had been missing from the beginning. Everything we had collected explained what went wrong, but this document could explain why the mistake continued for so long. The next morning, Michael asked me to meet him at his office before the HOA board reviewed the updated records. When I arrived, he placed the document on the table and explained that it came from the original development approval process. It was a signed verification form between the developer, the lender, and the original property records office. The purpose of the document was simple. It confirmed which areas belonged to the development, and which areas remained privately owned. When Michael pointed to the highlighted section, I immediately recognized the description. It matched the same property information that the bank had uncovered weeks earlier. The document clearly showed that the boundaries had been identified before the HOA was created. The information was not unavailable. It was not unclear. It had simply never become part of the HOA records. Michael explained that this changed the situation because it proved the HOA was not dealing with a complicated ownership question. They were dealing with an outdated internal record that had never been corrected. I asked him what this meant for Victoria Reynolds. He explained that the final decision would depend on how the HOA handled the information once they became aware of the mistake. The important thing was that the truth was now documented. Later that week, the HOA held another meeting. This time, the room felt completely different. Residents who once believed the issue was about one difficult homeowner were now asking questions about how the association managed important information. Victoria began the meeting by acknowledging that the HOA had relied on incorrect records. She explained that the board would review its procedures and create a new system for verifying property information before making future decisions. Michael presented the timeline carefully. He showed the original documents, the bank records, the county information, and the HOA records side by side. The comparison made one thing clear. The mistake did not come from one single action. It came from years of assuming that someone else had already checked the details. After the presentation, several residents spoke about their concerns. They did not want to blame individuals. They wanted a better process. That was the moment I realized the situation had changed completely. The same community that once watched me being dismissed was now asking how to prevent the same mistake from happening again. A few days later, the HOA officially updated its records and removed the incorrect information from its database. The community project that started the dispute was reviewed again using verified property documents instead of planning maps. Victoria also contacted me privately. She admitted that she had judged the situation too quickly and believed confidence in the HOA system meant the information must be correct. I told her that mistakes can happen, but the important part is what people do after discovering the truth. I thought that was the end of the story. The records were corrected, the process was improved, and the misunderstanding was resolved. But before leaving his office that week, Michael handed me one more envelope from the bank. Inside was a document that explained something about the original property agreement that even I had never known. It was not about the HOA anymore. It was about the history of the property itself. The envelope from the bank sat on my desk for 2 days before I opened it. After everything that had happened with the HOA, I thought I already understood the full story. The records had been corrected, the community procedures had changed, and the dispute that once seemed impossible to solve had finally reached a fair conclusion. But the document inside that envelope showed me something I never expected. It was not about the HOA. It was about the history of my property, and a decision made long before I ever lived there. Michael Brooks called me before I opened the envelope because he wanted to explain the importance of the document. He told me the bank had found an old financial agreement connected to the original purchase of the land. The agreement included a reference to a private property arrangement that had been preserved through every ownership transfer. When I read the document, I recognized the location immediately. It described the same section of land that had caused so much confusion with the HOA. But this time, the information was different. The document explained that the property had a protected status because of a previous agreement between the original owners and the lender. The agreement was created to ensure that future changes involving the land would require proper verification. It was another layer of protection that had existed quietly for decades. Michael explained that this was why the bank became interested. Financial institutions often maintain records connected to property history because ownership details affect long-term agreements. The bank was not trying to challenge the HOA. It was simply following the records and discovering information that had been overlooked. I spent that afternoon reviewing every page. I thought about how easily people can make assumptions when they only see part of the story. Victoria had looked at me and believed I had no influence because I did not present myself as someone important. She judged my position based on appearance instead of information. But the documents told a different story. They showed that property ownership is not determined by popularity, reputation, or who speaks the loudest at a meeting. It is determined by records. A few weeks later, I attended another HOA meeting. This time, the purpose was not to debate my situation. It was to discuss how the association would improve its procedures. The board invited a property specialist to explain the importance of verifying documents before making decisions that affect residents. The atmosphere was completely different from the first meeting. People listened carefully. Questions were asked respectfully. Everyone understood that the real issue had never been one homeowner versus the HOA. It had been about making sure decisions were based on accurate information. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me. They told me they had learned something valuable from the situation. They said they would pay closer attention to records, agreements, and the information behind future community decisions. I appreciated those conversations because that was the outcome I wanted from the beginning. I never wanted anyone to lose. I wanted the truth to be recognized. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the first meeting when I was treated like someone whose opinion did not matter. The difference between that moment and now was not that I became more important. The difference was that people finally looked at the facts. But there was still one final question I wanted answered. Why had the HOA records remained incorrect for so many years without anyone discovering the mistake? Michael had one last call scheduled with the county, and he believed the answer was hidden in the original development files. The answer to the final question came from the original development files that Michael Brooks reviewed with the county. After weeks of searching through records, we finally discovered why the HOA database had carried incorrect information for so many years. The mistake did not begin with Victoria Reynolds. It started much earlier, when the original development team created a simplified community map for residents and future planning. That map was useful for showing the layout of the neighborhood, but it was never meant to replace official ownership records. The problem was that over time, people stopped treating it as a reference and started treating it as proof. Michael explained that this was the missing link. The HOA did not intentionally create a false record. Instead, each new board member inherited information from the previous one and assumed it had already been verified. The same assumption continued for years until it finally affected a real property decision. The county confirmed that the original ownership documents, bank records, and development agreements all matched. The official records had always been available. They simply had not been compared against the HOA database. When I heard that, I realized how easily a small mistake can become a much bigger problem when nobody takes the time to question it. The county recommended that the HOA complete a full review of its property records and update any information that did not match official documents. Victoria agreed to the recommendation and announced that the association would create a new verification process before approving future projects. This time, the goal was not to defend an old decision. The goal was to prevent another mistake from happening. A few months later, I visited the HOA office for the first time since the dispute began. The difference was noticeable. The atmosphere was calmer. The board had new procedures in place, and residents were encouraged to review information before decisions were finalized. Victoria greeted me and admitted that she had made one major mistake. She had confused authority with certainty. She believed that because she was leading the HOA, she automatically had the correct information. She said the experience taught her that leadership requires asking questions, not just making decisions. I appreciated her honesty because that was the lesson I hoped everyone would take away. The situation had started with a public disagreement, but it ended with a better system for everyone. My relationship with the neighbors also changed. People who once saw me as someone causing problems began to see me as someone who cared about protecting the community from making the wrong decisions. I never wanted recognition. I only wanted the facts to be considered. Looking back, the most surprising part was not that the records proved I was right. The most surprising part was how long nobody had checked them. The truth had been sitting in county files, bank documents, and old agreements the entire time. It did not need to be created. It only needed to be found. As life returned to normal, I thought the story was finally complete. The HOA had corrected its records. The community had learned from the mistake. The property issue was resolved. But one evening, Michael called me with one final update. During the county review, they discovered another document connected to the original development approval. It was a record that had never been discussed during the HOA meetings. According to Michael, it could reveal the one decision that started the entire misunderstanding in the first place. The final document Michael Brooks mentioned turned out to be the missing piece that connected everything from the beginning. When I met him at his office, he placed the old development approval record on the table and explained that it was created before the neighborhood officially became an HOA community. The document was not about ownership because that had already been confirmed. It was about the original expectations for how property information would be maintained after development was completed. As I read through the pages, I noticed something important. The developer had included a requirement that all future community records needed to be compared with official property documents before being used for decisions. That requirement was never added to the HOA system. It was not because someone removed it. It was simply overlooked when the community changed management systems years later. Michael explained that this was the final answer to the question we had been asking. The incorrect information did not come from one person trying to create a problem. It came from a chain of assumptions where every person believed someone before them had already verified the details. The HOA president inherited the mistake. The board members trusted the records. The residents trusted the board. Eventually, that mistake affected someone who decided to look deeper. The county included the finding in its final review and recommended that the HOA preserve all historical documents connected to property decisions. The association followed the recommendation and created a permanent record system that required official verification before approving any future changes. Months later, I attended a community event at Silver Creek Estates. It was a completely different experience from the first meeting where I had been dismissed. Residents spoke openly about the importance of checking information before making decisions. The HOA board members answered questions instead of avoiding them. Victoria Reynolds also attended, and she spoke about the changes the association had made. She explained that leadership was not about always appearing correct. It was about being willing to admit when something needed to be improved. I appreciated that because the outcome was never about proving someone was less important than someone else. It was about making sure every person had the chance to be heard when the facts supported their position. Looking back, the most valuable lesson was not hidden in the bank records or the county files. It was in the process itself. The documents mattered because they created a clear path to the truth. Without them, the situation could have remained a simple disagreement where one side had more influence than the other. But records do not care about popularity. They do not care about appearances. They only show what happened. The person who was once treated as someone without importance was never actually powerless. He simply chose not to reveal everything until the right moment. The bank did not expose a secret because I wanted attention. It revealed the truth because the records finally reached the people who needed to see them. Today, I still live the same way I always have. I maintain my property, respect my neighbors, and focus on facts instead of arguments. The HOA learned an important lesson, and so did the community. A person should never be judged by how they look, what they drive, or how loudly they speak. The truth is often found in the documents everyone ignores until someone finally takes the time to read them.